Hello students, these are the review questions 1 through 9, and this section is all about graphing quadratics. For number 1, there was a slight typo, so I wanted you to see that I switched the 2 and the 4. This is just to avoid those pesky little fractions that would happen if you went with the original problem I had on the sheet. So our first step is to find the axis of symmetry. So we need to know what the formula for that is. And the formula is x equals negative b over 2a. Now we can label these numbers a, b, and c. So I'm going to plug in the numbers. We have negative b. Well, b is already negative 4. So when you have a negative times a negative, that's going to end up being a positive 4. Over 2a, and a is 2. So we end up with 2 times 2 there, which would give us 4, and 4 divided by 4 is 1. So our axis of symmetry is at x equals 1. That means I'm going to have a vertical line at x equals 1. In order to find the vertex, we know the vertex is going to be on the axis of symmetry. So we take that x equals 1 and we plug it into the function. So this f of 1, that's function notation, just meaning I'm plugging in 1 anywhere I see x. One squared is 1, and then 2 times 1 is 2. Negative 4 times 1 is negative 4 plus 3. So I have 2 minus 4 is negative 2 plus 3 is a positive 1. That means my vertex of the parabola is at 1, 1. So I'm going to go ahead and plot that. That's here at 1, 1 is right here. The other important thing to gather from standard form of a quadratic is the y-intercept. And that one's really easy to find from the standard form. You just look for the number that doesn't have x in the original function. So right here we see that plus 3 doesn't have an x. These two would cancel out if I plugged in zeros. So that means I have a point on the y-axis at 3. 1, 2, 3. And since quadratics have that axis of symmetry, if I have 1 away from the axis of symmetry here, I'll have it another away, 1 away on the other side. You could plug in other values to further find points on your quadratic, or for me, this is just a quick sketch, so you could just connect those 3 points. This is going to keep going up, and this is going to keep going up. All right, number 2. Again, the very first step is to find the axis of symmetry. X equals negative b over 2a. Now, there's not technically a number showing in front of x squared, but there's technically an invisible 1 there. So that's going to be our a, b, and c here. Plugging in negative b, well, b is 6, so that's going to be negative 6 over 2. A is negative 1. It's negative 6 over negative 2 ends up being a positive 3. So at x equals 3, we're going to have our axis of symmetry. Again, our vertex has to sit on the axis of symmetry, so we're going to plug in that 3 in order to solve for this. So we're going to have 3 squared, negative 3 squared, plus 6 times 3, plus 2. Well, 3 squared is 9, and then there's a negative out front, so it's going to end up being negative 9, plus 6 times 3 is 18, plus 2. That will give you negative 9 plus 18 is positive 9 plus 2 is 11. Now if I look at my graph, it does not actually count up to 11, so I'm going to have to count by 2's here. So it's going to be 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12. 11 will be halfway between there. So my vertex is at 3, 11. So we go over to 3, halfway between 10 and 12 is right here. That's my vertex. And then I can find my y-intercept. That's really easy from standard form. It's that number that does not have x. So my y-intercept is at 0, 2. So I'm going to plug in a point right here on the y-axis at 2. And then since this is, again, axis of symmetry, if I have 3 points, if I have my y-intercept is 3 away from the axis of symmetry here, I'll have a point that's 3 away on the other side. It always has to have a mirror image. Now that I have these 3 points, I can sketch my graph like that. If you want it to be more precise, you can find even more points on the quadratic. We notice that this quadratic is facing down. That's because there's this negative number out front of the x squared that will flip your parabola to face downward and give it so you have a maximum point. Question 3. Start off with your axis of symmetry. Negative b over 2a. This is a, b, and c. b is 10, so that's negative 10 over 5 times 2. Negative 10 over 10 is equal to negative 1. So that means I have my axis of symmetry at negative 1. I'm going to change my color for the rest of the graphing there. Then I'm going to plug in that negative 1 anywhere I see an x. Let's erase that. So I have f of negative 1. It's 5 times negative 1 squared plus 10 times negative 1 plus 6. Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. So you'll have positive 1 times 5. Plus 10 times negative 1 is negative 10 plus 6. That's 5 minus 10 is negative 5 plus 6 is positive 1. So the vertex is at negative 1, 1. I have my vertex right here. My y-intercept is the only number that doesn't have x with it in the function, so 6. It's a positive 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And again, with the axis of symmetry, that means I have 1 on the other side of the axis of symmetry with that. And I can draw my parabola with those points. Question number 4. Our negative b over 2a for our axis of symmetry. b is negative 12. So I'm going to have a negative 12. That's going to give me a positive 12 over 2 times negative 3. That'll be 12 over negative 6. When you divide that out, you'll get your axis of symmetry is at negative 2. So we're going to go ahead and draw that axis of symmetry. And then we're going to plug in that our negative 2 wherever we see x. So we have negative 2 squared, so that's negative 2 times negative 2 is positive 4. So we'll still have negative 3 times 4 there. Negative 12 times negative 2 is a positive 24. And minus 6. We take negative 3 times 4 next is negative 12. Plus 24 would be a positive 12. And then minus 6 will give us the y-coordinate of our vertex is at 6. So we have the point negative 2, 6. That will be on our axis of symmetry. So right there. And then our y-intercept is at negative 6, which we can find from looking up here at the function, the only number without y. Sorry, without an x. So I can plot that point at negative 6. 1, 2. And at the axis of symmetry, that means I need to have a point 2 away from the axis of symmetry right there. And now I can sketch my graph. That would be this quadratic. Again, we see it's facing down because the number in front of x squared is negative.